Greyfriars Cemetery. Greyfriars Cemetery is located right in the heart of Edinburgh. You can't miss it, because it has got this enormous church tower that looms over the entire city. It looks very striking, especially when it's all lit up at night. The cemetery was established back in 1820 and is still in use today. It contains around 70,000 graves and has a particularly high concentration of notable Scottish people buried within it, and this includes scientists, politicians, authors, actors, people from all walks of life. There's even an area specifically dedicated to the victims of the Highland clearances. These are the people who were brutally evicted from their homes in the Highlands in the 19th century. What's really interesting about Greyfriars is that despite it being so busy and so central, it also has a reputation for being haunted. And there are particular two ghosts that haunt the cemetery that have become quite famous. These are the Greyfriars, Bobby, and the Mackenzie Poltergeist. But first things first, let's take a look at the Mackenzie Poltergeist. This ghost is one of the most famous ones in Scotland. The story goes that in the early 20th century, there was a man named John Duncan Mackenzie. He was an apprentice stonemason, and he lived with his wife and their 6 children in a small cottage close to the cemetery. In fact, the cottage was actually built inside the cemetery walls, which meant that he didn't even need to leave the cemetery to go to work. One day in 1903, John fell ill with the Spanish flu and died shortly after. This was obviously very upsetting for his family, but they managed to pull through. But just 4 years later, his wife and 5 of his children would pass away. Again, this was just terrible, and in an effort to try and save money, the father, John Duncan, decided to bury his entire family himself. He dug the grave and buried them all in the backyard of the cottage. Now, according to reports, strange things started to happen in the cottage almost immediately after the burials. People reported hearing chains dragging metal moans, and they could also hear the sound of footsteps in the attic. It was clear that whatever was happening was coming from the backyard. So the local minister suggested that the family's bodies should be disinterred and moved into a proper grave inside the cemetery. As soon as they were moved, the haunting stopped. But not for long. A few years later, a new caretaker of the cemetery decided to build a new storeroom where the family had been buried. When he began digging the foundations for the building, he discovered the coffins of Mr. Mackenzie and his children. They were then reburied inside the cemetery. But again, the haunting continued. People who worked in the cemetery started reporting constant shaking of the ground and regular sightings of apparitions. Even an investigation by the Society for Psychical Research in 1959 corroborated these stories. At this point, it became clear that the only way to stop the haunting was to exhume the remains yet again and move them. And this time they decided to move them further out of the cemetery grounds into consecrated ground. And finally, the hauntings stopped. In 1964, a stone marker was erected by the Society of Psychical Research at the spot where the family originally lay in the cemetery, and this is now known as the Mackenzie Poltergeist site. Some people say that if you stand at the site and recite the Lord's Prayer backwards, then you might just see the ghost of Mr. Mackenzie himself. But what about Greyfriars, Bobby? Well, this is probably the most famous ghost in the entire cemetery, and it's thanks to a statue of him that sits right at the main entrance. The story goes that Greyfriars Bobby was a small terrier dog who belonged to a little girl named Helen. One day in 1858, Helen and her brother came to the cemetery to visit their father's grave. However, when they arrived, they found that their father had passed away, and that their mother was also terminally ill. Seeing that his owner was so upset, Bobby refused to leave his side, and so he stayed by the grave for the next 14 years, until he himself passed away in 1872, a local vet named John Peyton. He was so touched by the story that he erected a statue in honor of Bobby, and this is what you can see today. There are a lot of theories surrounding this statue. Some people say that if you walk past it without acknowledging it in some way, then Bobby will follow you around the cemetery and even outside of it. Apparently, he won't stop following you until you return to the statue and acknowledge it properly. Some people say that rubbing the nose of the statue brings you good luck, and others say that kissing the statue will help you find love. Maybe don't do any of those things though, because apparently if you don't behave properly, then Bobby might just bite you. There have been several reports of people being bitten by dogs while visiting the statue, and in 2015, someone even posted a picture online of themselves with their red, swollen hand after they'd tried to rub the statue. Regardless of whether or not Bobby is real, it seems like people are still keen to test their luck. And it isn't just the dog that you need to watch out for. It's said that the entire cemetery is haunted by over 100 ghosts. There are people who walk around the paths, shadowy figures who seem to drift in and out of sight. And if you're very lucky, you might even get a glimpse of a ghost cat. If you want to see a ghost in the cemetery, though, there is a place that you need to visit. It's called the Usher's Monument. It's a big stone tower in the center of the cemetery, and apparently this is the ghost capital of Greyfriars. It's said that Sir George and Lady Margaret Usher, they donated the land for the cemetery back in 1820, providing that they and any future generations of their family would be allowed to be buried there for free. There's a monument to them in the cemetery, and it's said that if you sit here and wait until sunset, then you might just see the ghosts of George and Margaret Usher, along with other apparitions. People often describe the ghosts they see here as dark and evil-looking and not the kind of ghosts that you want to mess around with. What's really interesting about this monument is that there's also a modern-day equivalent of it. It's right next door, and it's dedicated to the victims of the Highland clearances. This is a much more recent structure and was built in 1981. It's designed to resemble a broken Highland cottage and serves as a reminder of the brutal evictions that took place in the Highlands between 1846 and 1852. During this period, over 1 million Scots were evicted from their homes. They were killed or they simply died due to the appalling living conditions. Those that survived fled to major cities like Edinburgh and Glasgow in the hope of a better life. Many of them ended up dying in these cities and were buried in mass graves, which makes Greyfriars Cemetery something of a memorial site, as well as a place of remembrance for loved ones. If you want to learn more about the Highland clearances, I made a whole video about it. I'll put it on screen now. Thanks for watching.